money cannot buy. The dark and complicated truth behind Waddesdon Manor, the Rothschilds' palace on the hill. Power, prejudice, and the price of belonging in Gilded Age Europe. Prologue. Two versions of the same room. Start with the entrance hall. The one you see today is magnificent in the way that only things built with essentially unlimited money and the intention of overwhelming visitors can be. Gilded ceilings that catch the afternoon light filtering through tall French windows. Crystal chandeliers that were old when your grandparents were born. Renaissance portraits in ornate frames looking down at the tourists below with the particular expression of people who know they will still be here long after everyone in the room is gone. The air carries the faint smell of furniture polish and old silk. Tour guides speak in reverential half-whispers about Baron Ferdinand de Rothschild's exquisite taste. This is the version of Waddesdon Manor that appears on the postcards. It is beautiful, it is genuinely impressive, and it is profoundly incomplete. Now, take that same entrance hall and push it backward through time. It is November 1940. The chandeliers are dark. Heavy blackout curtains smother every window. Tape has been applied across the glass in careful X patterns, a crude shield against the pressure of nearby bomb blasts. Outside, searchlights sweep the Buckinghamshire sky as the German Luftwaffe works its way through England's infrastructure. Inside, the Grand Hall is cold and largely empty. The family is mostly gone. The regular staff has been reduced to a skeleton crew. And in the basement, in purpose-built strong rooms, created works of art from London's National Gallery. Paintings by Rembrandt, by Gainsborough, by Reynolds, wait out the Blitz in secret storage, hidden in a private Rothschild vault, because even some of Britain's official repositories felt less secure than a banker's country house on an isolated hilltop. Same room, two entirely different worlds, 53 years apart. That collision is what Waddesdon was built to contain. A French Renaissance chateau dropped onto an English hilltop. A palace constructed by a family that just a few generations earlier had been legally barred from owning land in most of Europe, not for any crime, but simply because they were Jewish. The Rothschilds built this house to prove they had arrived, that they belonged among England's landed gentry and titled aristocracy, that their money had purchased not only luxury, but something more elusive and more important: safety, acceptance, and a future that felt genuinely secure. They were wrong about the safety part, and this is the story of how they discovered that. Before we go inside, before we walk the galleries and examine the collections and discuss what it meant for a Jewish banking dynasty to construct a royal court in the English countryside while pretending to be simply very enthusiastic about architecture, there's a question that every gilded room in this building quietly asks, if you're paying attention. What do you build when you know, somewhere deep in your understanding of history and of your own family story, that no fortress is permanent, when the ground beneath your castle has always been contested, and when the people who smile at you over dinner are the same people who laugh at you behind your back? That question is the real architecture of Waddesdon Manor. The stone is just the answer someone tried to give it. Part 1. The fragile boy who became the builder. Ferdinand James Anselm de Rothschild was born in Paris in 1839 into the most consequential banking dynasty in the world, and he was not supposed to survive childhood. He was sickly from birth, pale, thin, prone to the respiratory illnesses that killed wealthy and poor children alike in the 19th century, and that wealthy families attempted to combat with private physicians, expensive tonics, and consultations conducted in anxious whispers outside closed bedroom doors. His father, Anselm, ran the Rothschild Bank in Frankfurt and Vienna. One uncle controlled the Paris house. Another held London. The family business stretched across 5 European capitals, moving gold and government bonds through a web of blood ties and encrypted correspondence that moved faster than most governments' own communication networks. Ferdinand's brothers were groomed for this empire. They were the robust ones, the confident heirs expected to sit through 4-hour dinners with finance ministers and remember which cousin had backed which railway project and which sovereign owed what to which branch of the family. Ferdinand was protected, kept apart, given the particular kind of attention that wealthy families lavish on children they expect to lose. Being the fragile one in a dynasty built on power teaches you specific things. It teaches you that your worth feels conditional, that you must prove yourself in registers your healthier brothers will never need to access. It teaches you that when the external world feels genuinely dangerous. And for a Rothschild in the 19th century, despite all the money, the external world was full of specific dangers. You compensate by building interior worlds you can control with precision. Ferdinand was eventually sent to England for his health. The damp English climate supposedly being kinder to his lungs than the harsher winters of the continental cities where his family maintained its offices. He arrived as a teenager, shy, foreign, his English uncertain, his role in the family's great machine essentially undefined. Then he fell in love. Her name was Evelina, and she was his cousin. The Rothschilds married within the extended family with deliberate regularity, a practice that kept the banking network tight, concentrated inheritances, and ensured that the family's most sensitive internal information never traveled beyond a circle of people connected by blood as well as commerce. Evelina was 18 when they married in 1865. Ferdinand was 26, and the surviving correspondence between them suggests something more than a calculated dynastic arrangement. Jokes, shared anxieties, plans for a life together that read like the letters of two people who have actually found each other rather than two people executing a family strategy. She died in childbirth 18 months later. The baby died with her. Here the historical record falls almost silent. Victorian men in general did not write easily about grief, and Rothschild men specifically were expected to steady empires and entertain royalty without displaying cracks in the facade. But Ferdinand's subsequent choices speak more clearly than any diary entry could. He stepped back from the family bank. He loosened his connections to Vienna and Frankfurt. He settled permanently in England and began collecting with an intensity that bordered on desperation. Porcelain, paintings, furniture, manuscripts, objects he could catalog and arrange and control with a precision that life had denied him in every other domain. By his early 30s, Ferdinand had assembled a collection that could rival public institutions. His London townhouse was overflowing. Rooms became storage areas. Staircases narrowed with crates. Every available surface displayed something. But collections of this scale demand more than walls. They demand a stage, a setting that announces to every visitor exactly how significant these objects are. They demand something that functions in the specific psychological register of a man who has lost everything that mattered most to him and is attempting to build something permanent in its place like a castle. The decision to build Waddesdon came in the early 1870s. Ferdinand would later write, with the careful understatement of a man who has learned not to show his cards, that he wanted a seat in the country worthy of his name and position. But beneath the polite phrasing, the psychology is clearer and more desperate. He was designing a place where he could nail beauty into permanence. A house that would force the English aristocracy, who still regarded the Rothschilds as foreign upstarts, Jewish, continental, too rich too quickly, to acknowledge that this banking family understood elegance as deeply as any ancient house. He was constructing a monument to control and a life that had systematically demonstrated how little could truly be controlled. The wound that drove Ferdinand never showed in the formal photographs. No dramatic scar, no visible damage, but it shaped every decision that followed. And it would take 15 years, hundreds of thousands of pounds, and an act of engineering that astounded everyone who witnessed it to translate that wound into stone and slate on a Buckinghamshire hilltop. Part 2. The hill that shouldn't have been possible. The locals thought he was out of his mind. Ferdinand purchased approximately 2,700 acres of Buckinghamshire countryside near the village of Waddesdon in 1874. The land itself was not the problem. The problem was the site he chose for the house. A bare, windswept hilltop that commanded spectacular views over the surrounding countryside, and that no architect with conventional instincts would have recommended for a major construction project. Building on a hill meant that everything required for construction had to be hauled upward. Stone, timber, brick, beam, thousands of tons of material defying gravity on roads that did not yet exist, toward a summit that had never supported anything heavier than sheep. The nearest railway station sat miles away. The village of Waddesdon itself was tiny, unprepared for the industrial scale of what was about to arrive. When Ferdinand's agents began placing enormous orders for materials and hiring laborers by the dozens, then by the hundreds, the full scope of the plan became impossible for even the most skeptical observer to dismiss. This was not a country house. It was a military campaign disguised as architecture. Ferdinand had hired Gabriel Philippe de Staël, a French architect, precisely because he wanted something that looked nothing like a traditional English estate. No Georgian symmetry, no calm Palladian proportions, no gentle deference to the landscape surrounding it. He wanted a Loire Valley chateau, the kind of structure that French nobility had commissioned in the 16th century when they needed to make a point to their king. The irony was apparent to everyone who considered it. A Jewish banker hiring a French architect to build a French palace on English soil in order to impress the English aristocracy. Ferdinand understood symbols better than most people. If you cannot be born into the established traditions of European elegance, you can at least purchase the blueprints and rebuild them, stone by stone, on foreign ground. Real work began in earnest around 1877. The first task was not the house at all, but the hill itself. The bare summit had to be reshaped, leveled in places, built up in others, prepared to carry foundations that the original terrain had never been designed to support. Steam-powered equipment, still a novelty in rural Buckinghamshire, was hauled onto the site to manage the excavation. Workers cut down to bedrock in critical areas and raised massive retaining walls to hold the altered ground in place. Then came the approach road. Ferdinand commissioned a winding drive that climbed the hill in carefully calculated curves, designed to reveal the house in controlled stages as a visitor ascended. The road was not a practical concession to geography. It was theater as deliberate as any scene in any opera Ferdinand might have attended in Vienna or Paris. You were meant to feel anticipation building with each turn, the house appearing in partial glimpses through the trees, growing larger and more overwhelming with each curve of the gravel, until the full facade finally broke into view and demanded that you stop and acknowledge it. Pale Bastogne arrived for the exterior walls. Welsh slate came for the roof. Ornamental carvings were entrusted to craftsmen brought specifically from France, because English craftsmen, however skilled, did not have the particular vocabulary of French Renaissance decoration that Ferdinand required. A central tower, wings extending east and west, dozens of tall multi-paned windows designed to flood the interiors with light in a way that the characteristically darker English country house almost never attempted. Every element of the building communicated the same message. This house was not from here, and it was not apologizing for that. But there was a dimension of Waddesdon that the paying guests almost never saw. Beneath the gilded reception rooms, beneath the portrait galleries and the winter garden and the smoking room designed for princes, lay a hidden infrastructure of extraordinary complexity. Service corridors running the length of the basement. Kitchens equipped to produce banquets for dozens of guests at a level of precision that would have impressed a military logistics officer. Sculleries and storage vaults, and wine cellars and laundry facilities and coal rooms, and the mechanical systems. Pumping stations, boilers, eventually electrical generators that transformed a limestone chateau into a functioning 21st century machine while maintaining the appearance of effortless aristocratic timelessness above stairs. The servants' world was deliberately, architecturally invisible. Staff entered through separate doors. They moved along carefully planned routes designed to ensure that their presence would not impinge on the experience of family members or guests unless those staff members were specifically summoned. This was not Ferdinand's personal cruelty. It was simply the established grammar of great house architecture. But the scale at Waddesdon pushed the system further than most English estates attempted. Ferdinand employed dozens of staff from the moment the house opened, and as the operation expanded, that number would rise well past 100. The house was designed to broadcast taste and refinement. It functioned beneath that broadcast like a precision factory. And the workers who kept that factory running were as essential to the performance of aristocratic elegance as any painting on the walls, and as carefully hidden from view. By 1883, the main structure was complete. Ferdinand moved in before the interiors were entirely finished, unable or unwilling to wait any longer. The French palace on the English hilltop had stopped being an idea on paper. It was stone and glass and slate, visible for miles in every direction, dominating the landscape exactly as its creator had demanded. The locals stopped calling him mad. They started calling him barren. But the performance was only beginning. A house this size, this expensive, this deliberately provocative in its announcement of cultural and financial ambition, needed an audience equal to its pretensions. And Ferdinand knew exactly who he needed to invite. Part 3. The performance. Princes, politicians, and the price of acceptance. Ferdinand understood, with the particular acuity of someone who has studied belonging from the outside for his entire life, that Waddesdon was not simply a residence. It was a stage, and the production he was mounting required the most powerful audience that money and careful social engineering could assemble. Not simply wealthy acquaintances, not fellow bankers or business associates who could be impressed through conventional means. He needed the people whose presence would confirm everything the house had been constructed to argue. He needed royalty. The Prince of Wales, Albert Edward, the future Edward VII, first visited Waddesdon in the 1880s. The precise date blurs in the historical record, as such visits often do when discretion is everyone's preferred operating mode. But the significance was unmistakable. The heir to the British throne was sleeping under a Rothschild roof, eating at a Rothschild table, smoking Rothschild cigars in a smoking room that had been designed with exactly this kind of moment in mind. To any observer of English social architecture, this looked like acceptance, or at least it looked like the costume of it. The weekend house parties at Waddesdon quickly became famous. Invitations were hunted, compared, and bragged about in precisely the way that Ferdinand intended. Guests arrived at the local railway station in private carriages and transferred to Ferdinand's own vehicles for the final ascent, the winding drive doing its choreographed work, trees opening to framed glimpses of stone and towers, the chateau revealing itself in stages until it broke into full view and demanded acknowledgement. Inside, every detail had been engineered for effect. Electric lighting, still a genuine novelty in most English country houses, washed the reception rooms in warm, dependable light. An advanced heating system maintained comfortable temperatures throughout the building in deep winter, a standard that many older aristocratic houses with their ancient fireplaces and drafty corridors could not match. Hot water waited in guest bedrooms. These details mattered because Ferdinand had studied, with a systematic intelligence that characterized everything he undertook, precisely what the British elite valued, and then met that standard with something a degree more polished, more modern, more impressive. The weekend rhythm settled into the established pattern of aristocratic leisure. Friday, arrivals and introductions over tea. Saturday, shooting parties across the carefully managed estate grounds, stocked with game birds for exactly this purpose. Long dinners extending to 10 or 12 courses, each served with a timing and precision that required hours of behind-the-scenes preparation. The traditional post-dinner separation, men drifting to the smoking room, women to the drawing room, before the company reassembled for cards, music, and conversation that extended well past midnight. But the genuinely important business rarely happened at the dinner table. It happened in corners, in low-voiced exchanges between courses, in the library after midnight, when most guests had gone upstairs and a small circle of men remained with brandy and the particular quality of attention that develops when powerful people know they are not being observed. Ministers discussed government financing. Investors exchanged intelligence about markets. Foreign envoys hinted at what was shifting in their country's relationships with England. Deals that would have looked suspicious on a banking floor moved more smoothly in a country house library after midnight, when the setting implied that this was simply conversation among friends rather than transactions among principals. Ferdinand did not officially transform his weekends into banking conferences. He had, after all, stepped back from daily financial operations, or at least he maintained that appearance with some consistency. But he was still a Rothschild, and the family's network was still functioning, and when ministers needed to raise capital or investors needed reliable intelligence about foreign markets or delicate arrangements required confidentiality that no counting house could provide, those needs did not dissolve at the front door of Waddesdon. They simply shifted into more elegant containers. The British aristocracy came. They admired the art. They marveled at the technology. They praised the food. And then they went home and wrote things in private letters and printed things in satirical magazines that Ferdinand saw and heard and had, by long practice, learned to absorb without visible reaction. The magazine Punch published cartoons. Rothschild figures appeared in caricature with exaggerated features, clinging to money bags or pulling puppet strings attached to tiny politicians. These images ran not in underground pamphlets, but in mainstream periodicals sold on street corners across England. The anti-Semitism was casual, normalized, woven into the texture of everyday public discourse in ways that made it nearly impossible to challenge directly without appearing to confirm the underlying anxiety. Ferdinand saw the cartoons. He heard the drawing room jokes about Jewish millionaires purchasing their way into the landed gentry. He kept his reactions private because what response was available to him? Protesting publicly would only prove the barbs had found their target. So he answered in the only register he believed might eventually work. He escalated. More art, more precision, more celebrated guests. If the house was whispered about as excessively lavish, he made it more dazzling. If his hospitality was dismissed as ostentatious, he made it more meticulous. The counter to exclusion was to become so socially indispensable, so visually impressive, so woven into the fabric of English high life that ignoring him would begin to look ridiculous. In many ways, the strategy worked. The Prince of Wales kept returning. Other members of the royal family followed. Cabinet ministers and foreign dignitaries became regular fixtures on the guest lists. Waddesdon shifted from curiosity to fixture, an expected stop on the circuit for anyone who mattered in that world, as natural a destination for a weekend in autumn as any great house in England. Yet late at night, when the last carriage lamps had vanished down the drive and the servants had cleared the final glasses and the house fell into its post-performance quiet, Ferdinand sometimes walked the rooms alone, past the portraits he had rescued from European collections, through spaces furnished with pieces that had once belonged to French royalty before revolution stripped them away, standing inside a chateau that had consumed 15 years and a fortune to build, surrounded by evidence of his taste and his persistence and his determination to be acknowledged. The performance was impeccable. The audience applauded. The social calendar confirmed his success. But one question lingered beneath the applause, and it was the question that had driven him to build Waddesdon in the first place. Was he safe yet? Had this finally been enough? The honest answer, the one he could never quite shake, was always the same. Not yet. Not entirely. Not in the way he actually needed. So the weekends continued. The trains kept arriving. The rooms stayed full. And Ferdinand kept demonstrating again and again that he belonged in a world that was still, very quietly, deciding whether it would ever fully let him in. Part 4. The engine beneath the elegance. How the Rothschild money actually worked. Most people, when they hear the word Rothschild, think very rich bankers. This is accurate, but approximately as useful as describing the Atlantic Ocean as quite a lot of water. The mechanisms behind the wealth, how it was created, how it moved, what it paid for, and what it cost, were considerably more intricate than that description suggests. And understanding them is essential to understanding why Waddesdon existed and what it was really for. The system began with a patriarch and 5 sons. Mayor Amschel Rothschild ran a modest but ambitious banking operation in Frankfurt's Jewish Quarter in the late 18th century. As his 5 sons came of age, he did something that would prove to be one of the more consequential decisions in the history of modern finance. He deployed them across Europe. Nathan went to London, James to Paris, Salomon to Vienna, Karl to Naples. Amschel remained in Frankfurt. 5 sons, 5 cities, 5 banking houses that operated not as competitors, but as a single distributed organism. The real innovation was not money. It was information. Before telegraphs and telephones, before the electronic infrastructure that makes contemporary finance possible, information traveled at the speed of horses and sailing ships. It was slow, unreliable, and subject to interception. The Rothschilds built their own courier network, trusted riders carrying encrypted correspondence between the 5 branches, moving faster than official diplomatic mail, faster than the communications of most sovereign governments. They heard about military developments, political crises, and market shocks before almost anyone else. Information, in their hands, became profit with a reliability that no other institution could match. When Napoleon was defeated at Waterloo in 1815, Nathan Rothschild in London reportedly knew before the British government did. His couriers arrived first. What he did with that lead has been the subject of storytelling and argument ever since. Later accounts, some promotional, some hostile, turned the episode into a legend of market manipulation. The more sober historical consensus is that he moved quickly on superior information, positioning himself in the bond market before the official news arrived and generating enormous gains. However the specifics are parsed, the Napoleonic Wars left the Rothschilds as the dominant banking family in Europe, and they remained there for the better part of the following century. They lent to governments, and this is the key to understanding their power. Not through conquest or territorial acquisition, but through bonds and loans. When Britain needed to finance wars, Rothschild funds filled the gap. When France had to pay war reparations after 1815, the family structured the payments. When new nations emerged from the wreckage of old empires and needed capital to establish central banks and armies, it was frequently a Rothschild office that took the first meeting. This made them indispensable, and it painted a target on their backs that would only grow larger as the century progressed. The network's great strength was also its most politically dangerous characteristic. It did not pledge exclusive loyalty to any single nation. Capital moved wherever opportunity existed. The family's branches financed British railway expansion, French government borrowing, Austrian industrial schemes, American Civil War bond issues. In peacetime, this transnational flexibility was brilliant. Money flowing efficiently between London and Paris and Vienna, contracts negotiated between cousins who trusted each other absolutely, profits accumulating across the network without the friction of national boundaries. In wartime, it became almost impossible to explain without appearing sinister. Waddesdon sat inside this structure as one carefully managed node, not a formal bank branch, not a place where ledgers were signed or bonds issued, but a space where power could gather away from official scrutiny. Ministers, investors, and foreign envoys could be entertained far from parliamentary debates and newspaper offices. Conversations that would have looked suspicious in a counting house could develop naturally over dinner or during a walk through the gardens. With no paper trail and no witnesses beyond a staff trained to remember nothing they overheard. The morally complex dimension of this system was rarely examined in the family's own time and has been only partially reckoned with since. The Rothschilds funded hospitals, schools, charitable institutions, water systems, and civic infrastructure on a scale that few private families have ever matched. They also financed wars, colonial ventures, and economic policies that enriched certain nations while draining others. The same bonds that funded European railway construction helped extract raw materials from Africa and Asia. The same network that could stabilize financial panics concentrated extraordinary economic power inside a circle of related families whose decision-making was answerable to no public institution. Whether Ferdinand, wandering his galleries late at night, wrestled privately with these contradictions is something the archives do not reveal. What the archives do confirm is that he understood the core transaction. The chateau on the hill existed because the money machine existed, and the money machine functioned because it was fast, transnational, and fundamentally loyal to the family interest above any national one. That was old money in one of its most concentrated and honest forms. Not a fairy tale of individual genius rewarded by fair world, but wealth built through a system that operated above the level of ordinary accountability, and that generated both extraordinary results and extraordinary resentments. Waddesdon was beautiful. The gardens were theatrical. The art was museum quality. Guests remembered the glow of chandeliers and the sweep of staircases and the impeccable timing of a 10-course dinner. But beneath every polished surface, a harder question sat quietly in its own gilded frame. What had all this beauty cost? And who, exactly, had paid for it? Part 5, Below Stairs, the invisible people who made it possible. A day at Waddesdon began long before anyone upstairs opened their eyes. 4:30 in the morning, perhaps 5 at the latest. By the time the family woke, the house had to be fully operational. Fires lit, water heating, ovens working, every surface cleaned to a standard that made the night's accumulation of dust and ash seem never to have existed. The illusion of effortless luxury required an enormous and largely invisible infrastructure of human labor. And that labor began hours before the first footman knocked on the first bedroom door. Kitchen maids were the earliest risers, responsible for lighting the coal ranges. Massive iron stoves that needed time to reach the temperatures required for serious cooking and that consumed fuel at rates that made the coal cellar a center of constant logistical attention. Scullery staff hauled water and managed the basic mechanical requirements of a kitchen designed to produce meals for dozens of people at any given weekend. Housemaids moved through the reception rooms with the systematic efficiency of people who have learned to clean under genuine time pressure, removing the previous day's ash from fireplaces, laying fresh fires, dusting furniture that had been dusted yesterday and would be dusted again tomorrow. The butler occupied a position of genuine authority in this world. At Waddesdon, that authority was substantial. He managed the male staff, footmen, under-butlers, hall boys, with the precise hierarchical attention of someone who understands that a great household functions only when everyone knows exactly what they are responsible for and executes it without being asked twice. He controlled the wine cellar, one of the finest private collections in England, and he choreographed the service of dinners that might extend to 12 courses and require the precise coordination of a dozen people working in a space designed to make their coordination invisible. The housekeeper held equivalent power over the female staff. She directed housemaids, ladies' maids, and laundry workers, kept meticulous linen inventories, inspected bedrooms before guests arrived and after they left, and maintained standards that allowed no meaningful exceptions. A streak on a mirror, a crease in a fresh bedsheet, evidence of dust in a corner that should have been addressed. Any of these could result in consequences that ranged from formal reprimand to dismissal, depending on how many times the failure had occurred and how visible it might have been to family or guests. The hierarchy below stairs was as rigid as anything operating above it, possibly more so, because below stairs, the consequences of deviation were immediate and practical. At the top sat the butler and housekeeper, their authority effectively absolute within their domains. Just beneath them, valets and ladies' maids, those who dressed the family and their guests, managed wardrobes, and handled the personal possessions of people who possessed an extraordinary quantity of things worth managing. Below that layer came the footmen and housemaids, then the kitchen staff, then, at the bottom of a structure that everyone understood and no one discussed openly, the scullery maids and hall boys, teenagers performing the most physically demanding and least visible work for the smallest wages. The bell system was the nervous system of this entire operation. Every principal room in the house connected, through a system of springs and wires running through the walls, to a corresponding bell in the servants' corridor below. Experienced staff could identify the calling room by the pitch and pattern of the sound alone, and when a bell rang, someone moved. Immediately, the family and their guests did not wait. The performance of effortless luxury depended on responses so quick that they seemed automatic, as if comfort materialized from thin air rather than from a human being who had been standing by, ready, in a corridor specifically designed to keep that readiness invisible. What the servants actually thought of this arrangement is preserved only partially in fragments of letters and household account books that survived in attic boxes no one examined seriously for generations. The picture those fragments assemble is genuinely complicated. The Rothschilds paid well by the standards of the era, better, in most years, than equivalent positions at many aristocratic houses. The work was exhausting and the hours were long, but the wages were competitive and the household was run, by most contemporary accounts, with a reasonably consistent fairness. Yet the imbalance of power was structural and absolute. A servant could be dismissed for almost anything: an error, a complaint, a personality clash with a supervisor, a domestic relationship that the household considered inappropriate. Dismissal meant simultaneous loss of income, housing, and, most devastatingly, the reference letter that made future employment possible. Without a strong reference from a recognized household, finding a comparable position was nearly impossible. The Rothschilds were not tyrants. By most accounts, they treated staff considerably better than many of their social peers. But kindness exercised from a position of total control is still a form of control. A generous master is still a master. The servants of Waddesdon kept the entire machine running. They maintained the illusion that wealth and beauty existed effortlessly, that fireplaces lit themselves and 12-course dinners materialized without planning or labor. They enabled Ferdinand's performance of belonging and, after his death, his successor's performance of continuity. They did all of this knowing that no matter how critical their work was, no matter how literally impossible the house would have been without them, they would never dine in the Great Hall, never sit in the library, never own anything remotely comparable to the objects they cleaned and polished and arranged every single day of their working lives. That was the bargain. That was how old money operated, not simply as accumulated capital, but as accumulated invisible labor, other people's effort built into the walls, and then written out of the story that the walls told about themselves. The servants' bells still hang in the corridors below the main house. Part of the museum displays now, silent and still. But once they rang constantly, and every time they did, someone ran. Part 6, the cartoons and the country clubs being welcome and unwanted simultaneously. In 1898, the same year Ferdinand died, a cartoon appeared in a French newspaper. It showed a grotesque figure with exaggerated features and clawed hands wrapped around a globe labeled World Finance. The caption named it simply, Rothschild. This was not unusual. Images like this appeared regularly across Europe, in Germany, in Austria, in France, and England. The specific details shifted. Sometimes the figure clutched money bags. Sometimes it pulled puppet strings attached to miniature politicians. Sometimes both. But the core message never varied. The Rothschilds as sinister, inhuman forces secretly controlling events that ordinary people experienced as natural or inevitable. Hidden hands behind visible history. These were not underground publications. They ran in mainstream newspapers and popular magazines sold on street corners and in respectable shops. The anti-Semitism was casual, normalized, embedded in the ordinary texture of educated public discourse in a way that made it nearly impossible to challenge without appearing to confirm the anxiety that drove it. And yet, the Prince of Wales kept visiting Waddesdon. Queen Victoria had attended Rothschild weddings. The family held titles, Baron Ferdinand, Baron Lionel, Baron Nathaniel, granted by the British Crown and other European monarchies. They appeared on guest lists for state occasions. Their donations funded hospitals and schools and public parks. Buildings in London carried their name. They were simultaneously essential to the machinery of European civilization and objects of its most elaborate prejudices. The English aristocracy embodied this contradiction with particular precision. They came to Waddesdon's parties. They admired the collections. They turned to Rothschild banks when their own estates needed rescuing, which in the latter half of the 19th century happened with considerable frequency as the old landed wealth found itself outmaneuvered by the new industrial and commercial fortunes. Some members of the aristocracy even married Rothschild daughters when the dowries were large enough to address the most pressing financial problems. And then they went home and wrote things in private letters about our Israelite friends and Oriental taste and hospitality that was not quite the same as a weekend with the Devonshires. Ferdinand heard all of it. He was too intelligent, too well-connected, and too practiced in the social codes of the world he was trying to enter not to hear it. And his response was consistent throughout his life because it was the only response he believed might eventually work. He escalated. He refined. He perfected. He made Waddesdon more dazzling, more precise, more impossible to dismiss. If they were going to sneer regardless, let them sneer at something so magnificent that the sneering required genuine effort. This was defensive architecture in a very specific sense. Not only stone walls and towers, but taste and cultural mastery sharpened into a shield against prejudice. Every flawless dinner party was an exhibit. Every royal visit was a line of evidence. Every painting acquired from a collection that an ancient aristocratic family had been forced to sell to cover debts was a quiet argument about whose judgment had proven more durable. But belonging purchased through sustained perfection is exhausting in ways that inherited belonging never is. Because once perfection becomes the entry ticket, it must be maintained perpetually. One scandal, one failure of taste, one moment of seeming too Jewish or too foreign or too aggressively wealthy in the wrong context, and a fragile acceptance that had taken decades to build could shatter in an afternoon. The Rothschilds could not afford to be merely excellent. They had to be exceptional in every direction simultaneously. Their houses more impressive than anyone else's. their parties more polished, their philanthropy more visible, their business dealings more discreet. Any failure seemed to confirm what the cartoons already claimed, that they were outsiders performing the costume of belonging rather than genuine members of the establishment they were attempting to join. That pressure, the pressure of needing to be perfect because imperfection would be interpreted as proof of fundamental inadequacy, seeped into everything. Into the obsessive attention to detail at Waddesdon, into the carefully curated guest lists, into the political donations spread across multiple parties so that whoever held office would feel some obligation to the family, into the marriage policy that kept money and influence tightly concentrated within a small circle of people who could be trusted absolutely, into the disciplined public silence whenever a new caricature appeared or a new exclusion was confirmed. Never complain, never explain, never give the fire additional fuel. The English aristocracy sometimes traced their lineages to knights who had crossed the Channel with William the Conqueror in 1066. The Rothschild story ran through Frankfurt's Jewish quarter, streets where Jewish residents had been legally locked in at night for centuries, restricted in their permitted trades, denied the right to own land or enter most professions, treated as permanent outsiders by institutions that claimed to represent civilization. Ferdinand had been gone from that world for decades by the time he built Waddesdon. But the family carried its memory in its institutional reflexes, in their instinct for speed, in their obsession with control, in their relentless need for the kind of polish that announces, "I understand every code of this culture better than you thought possible." History had taught them, with painful consistency across generations, that safety was always temporary, that being simultaneously loved and despised was the normal condition of their existence, that you could own a palace and still not own your place in the country surrounding it. The cartoons kept appearing, the invitations kept arriving, and the Rothschilds kept walking the same impossible line, visible enough to matter, not so visible as to become the perfect enemy, wealthy enough to command respect, not so ostentatiously wealthy that resentment boiled over, Jewish enough to remain themselves, not so openly Jewish that Christian society found an excuse to turn away. No one could walk that line forever. And then the world gave the line a harder test than anyone had anticipated. Part 7. The War That Broke the Network. The balancing act ended in August 1914, when war erupted across Europe with a speed that surprised even the governments that had been preparing for it. The Rothschild banking network, designed over a century to float above national borders, built on blood ties between 5 capitals, optimized for a world where capital moved faster than armies, suddenly became impossible to operate as it had been. Nations demanded clear loyalty in ways they had not imposed during the diplomatic crises and smaller conflicts of the 19th century. You were British, or you were German, or you were French, or you were Austrian. You cannot be all of them simultaneously. The logic of the transnational banking dynasty had met the logic of modern total war, and there was no accommodation between them. The London Rothschilds were British. The Vienna and Frankfurt branches belonged, by the political geography of 1914, to the Central Powers. The Paris house was French, the same family, separated by the lines on maps that were now backed by machine guns and mobilized millions. Cousins who had exchanged information and coordinated transactions for decades woke up to find themselves on opposite sides of a conflict in which expressing any sympathy for the other side's position was a species of treason. What do you do when your own family is officially the enemy? The practical answer was you stop talking. The London Rothschilds cut formal communication with Vienna and Frankfurt. Business connections that had operated smoothly for the better part of a century were suspended or quietly dissolved. The network that had been their greatest competitive advantage, the thing that had allowed them to know what was happening in Vienna before London's government did, to move capital between capitals before other banks had finished reading the morning dispatches, became a liability. Each branch now had to demonstrate loyalty to its own nation, and the easiest way to demonstrate that loyalty was to behave as if the other branches barely existed. The estate itself was geographically far from any front line. No trenches appeared in Ferdinand's gardens. No shells landed on his towers. But the war arrived at Waddesdon anyway, carried by the men who left and did not return. Footmen enlisted, Hall boys signed their names at recruiting offices and went to France. Gardeners joined up. The under-butler, the second footman, 3 of the stable hands. They disappeared from the household ledgers and appeared, weeks later, in military records. Some came back with wounds. Some came back in coffins. Some were simply never heard from again, their names ending in the casualty list with the same abrupt finality as everyone else's. Their names were eventually chiseled into the estate's war memorial, raised after the fighting ended. A simple stone, the names carved in alphabetical order, with no distinction between servants and family members. In death, for once, the hierarchy that had organized every dimension of life at Waddesdon fell silent. The house kept going, but only barely. James de Rothschild, who had inherited Waddesdon from his mother Alice after Ferdinand's death, enlisted himself despite being in his 40s. He served, was wounded, returned to duty. While he was away, the chateau sat essentially empty, a reduced staff maintaining it in slow motion. Fires lit to prevent damp from establishing itself in the walls. Basic upkeep performed, the gardens managed at a fraction of their normal intensity. The damage to the wider Rothschild network was considerably more severe. The Vienna branch, once among the most powerful, was gutted by the collapse of the Austro-Hungarian Empire after 1918. Properties were seized, assets frozen or written down to nominal values. The Frankfurt House faced comparable pressure inside a defeated and increasingly unstable Germany. What had taken 5 generations to build fractured along national lines that had barely existed in the ideological landscape when the system was first constructed. And beneath all of it lay a realization that Ferdinand, designing his monument to permanence in the 1870s, had somehow failed to account for. Money cannot insulate anyone from industrialized slaughter. The Rothschilds had financed railways and governments and the construction of entire national infrastructures. They had underwritten national debts and built palaces and purchased masterpieces and entertained princes beneath ceilings covered in gold leaf. None of that meant anything to machine guns and high-explosive shells. When millions of men were mobilized to kill and be killed in conditions of systematic industrial horror, no chateau on a hill guaranteed that its staff or its owners or their cousins would be spared. Ferdinand's dream of security through cultural achievement looked, from 1918, increasingly like exactly what it had always been, a performance of permanence rather than the thing itself. You could build a perfect house. You could fill it with extraordinary beauty. You could demonstrate, through 15 years of construction and decades of impeccable weekend parties, that you understood elegance as well as any family in England. And then war arrived, and the boys who had polished your silver died in French mud, and your family's transnational business was shredded along battle lines, and all that perfection revealed how little of what actually mattered it had managed to control. When James returned to Waddesdon after 1918, he found a house that was both unchanged and completely different. The walls were intact. The collections were in place. The gardens could be restored with enough money and time. But the war memorial stood in the grounds with its alphabetical list of names, and it was the most honest thing on the estate. Fixed, unarguable, permanent in a way that all of Ferdinand's social engineering had never quite managed to be. Part 8. The Gathering Storm, when the world turned lethal. The interwar years at Waddesdon had a particular quality of determined normality that, in retrospect, reads as a form of collective denial. James de Rothschild reopened the house fully in the early 1920s. The staff was rebuilt, though never quite to pre-war numbers. The gardens were coaxed back into their formal geometry. The chandeliers blazed again. Weekend guests arrived in Rolls-Royces and Bentleys instead of private railway carriages. Jazz crackled from gramophones in the drawing rooms, and cocktails began to compete with the multi-course Victorian dinners that still appeared when the occasion demanded ceremony. Modernity was arriving at the chateau, bringing with it a loosening of the social rules that had governed the world Ferdinand had built Waddesdon to enter. In theory, this should have made life easier for the Rothschilds. If the old barriers were lowering, if society was becoming more fluid and the lines between old wealth and new wealth were blurring, then a family of Jewish bankers with a French chateau in England ought to find their position increasingly secure. Anti-Semitism, however, was modernizing too. In Germany, the Weimar Republic lurched between hyperinflation, political coups, and street violence as a dozen different factions competed to determine what the post-war German nation would become. The Nazis started as a fringe party with no realistic political prospects, then grew, then became something that serious political analysts could no longer dismiss. Their propaganda fixated on Jewish finance with a consistency and an intensity that distinguished it from the casual social prejudice that Ferdinand had navigated in Victorian England. They were not speaking in the coded language of drawing room dismissal. They used names. Rothschild appeared in pamphlets, speeches, and broadcast materials as shorthand for everything they claimed was corrupting Germany. The perfect symbol, combining Jewish identity with international financial reach in a way that made them the ideal target for a movement that needed a concrete enemy to give its abstractions visible form. News of this reached Waddesdon through letters from relatives still maintaining the family's presence in Frankfurt and Vienna. The tone darkened with each passing year. Business restrictions tightening, exclusion from professional associations and social clubs, beatings in the streets, shop windows smashed and not repaired. The machinery of a modern state, courts, bureaucracy, police, and eventually the military, being turned piece by piece and with increasing speed against Jewish wealth and Jewish existence. James read these letters in the Waddesdon Library, the same room where Ferdinand had once entertained the Prince of Wales, where cabinet ministers had talked policy over brandy and cigars, where the illusion of rock-solid Rothschild security had been most carefully curated. That illusion was cracking across the continent with a speed that even the most optimistic assessment could no longer explain away. England still felt safer. British anti-Semitism certainly existed. The drawing room jokes had not stopped. The club doors that remained closed to Jewish members had not opened. The casual slights of a society that had never fully incorporated its Jewish citizens had not dissolved. But it did not yet carry the systematized, state-directed brutality that was developing in Germany and Austria. The Rothschilds faced prejudice and glass ceilings in England. They did not yet face the organized machinery of elimination. Waddesdon began to function in a double register. On weekends with British guests, everything looked as it always had. Shooting parties, formal dinners, conversation flowing under chandeliers, the full performance of aristocratic leisure maintained with the same precision that Ferdinand had established. On quieter weeks, when only family were present, the same rooms hosted different conversations. Escape routes and timelines. What to do with the Frankfurt house. Whether to liquidate the Vienna assets before the window closed entirely. How to move vulnerable relatives to London or Paris before borders tightened and movement became impossible. By the mid-1930s, no one could pretend not to see what was happening in Germany. Hitler's government was in power. The Nuremberg laws had stripped German Jews of citizenship and civil rights. The Frankfurt Rothschild Bank, the original house, the one Mayor Amschel had built in the Jewish quarter over a century before, was forced to close. The ancestral property was seized. Then came November 1938. Kristallnacht. Letters and cables arrived at Waddesdon describing synagogues burning, Jewish shops smashed and looted across Germany and Austria, men pulled from their homes and beaten in the streets. This was not spontaneous fury. It was coordinated, state-directed violence against a specific population, conducted in the open by officials who faced no consequences for it. James convened a family meeting at Waddesdon in late 1938. The agenda was the one that Ferdinand had spent his entire career and his entire fortune trying never to have to discuss: survival. How to extract remaining relatives from Germany and Austria. How to protect whatever assets could still be legally moved. How to keep the functioning parts of the banking enterprise alive, while accepting that some branches would have to be abandoned. The chateau on its English hilltop felt simultaneously sheltered and exposed. Geographically, it was far from the worst of the violence. Symbolically, it was precisely the kind of visible Jewish wealth that fascist propaganda required to justify its arguments. The same features that had made Waddesdon Ferdinand's triumph, its scale, its French Renaissance grandeur, its undeniable announcement of financial power, now made it a perfect illustration in any narrative about the supposed dangers of Jewish influence. The paintings in the collection were beginning to travel quietly, to London vaults, to Paris storage rooms where they might be safer than on the walls of houses under threat. Not decorations anymore. Condensed portable wealth, assets that could be moved quickly if circumstances required it, or sold to fund escapes if it came to that. By 1939, the question was no longer whether war would return to Europe. It was what and who would still exist when it ended. Ferdinand had built Waddesdon to last forever, to nail down permanence, to prove that the Rothschilds belonged in Europe as deeply as any family with a coat of arms older than the printing press. 60 years after he began construction, Europe was preparing to tear itself apart again. And this time, the Rothschilds were not simply convenient symbols in satirical cartoons. They were being named explicitly as enemies by a state with the means and the stated intention to act on that designation. The lights at Waddesdon would go dark again soon. This time, no one could be certain they would ever come back on. Part 9, Blackout, the war, the crates, and the family in hiding. The blackout order came in September 1939. Every window at Waddesdon had to be covered before dusk. Heavy curtains went up across the tall French windows that Ferdinand had designed to flood the interior with light. Tape was applied across the glass in X patterns to reduce shattering from bomb blasts. The chandeliers that had once symbolized the family's conquest of darkness. Electric light blazing in a Buckinghamshire countryside that still relied largely on gas and candles when Waddesdon first opened, went dark. The house became a shadow of itself. Its most dramatic visual feature, suddenly one of the things that endangered everyone in it. James de Rothschild enlisted again, though he was now in his 40s and had already served and been wounded in the previous war. The family's London house was closed. Waddesdon became the main refuge, but in a stripped-down version. Most of the regular staff gone, conscripted or drawn into war industries. The formal rooms existing largely for their own sake. The skeleton crew keeping the basic maintenance going that prevented damp and cold from beginning the structural damage that neglect invites. The formal gardens were abandoned to their own resources. The greenhouses that had once produced exotic orchids for Ferdinand's weekend parties were converted to growing vegetables. It was practical and it was symbolic. The house built to showcase refinement had contracted to simple survival. Then came a quiet request from the British government. The National Gallery in London needed safe storage. German bombing raids were targeting London's cultural infrastructure alongside its industrial and military targets. Priceless paintings and sculptures that represented the nation's artistic heritage needed to be moved somewhere secure. Somewhere with thick walls, controlled conditions, geographic distance from a bombing, and the kind of institutional reliability that only a small number of private houses in England could offer. Waddesdon met every criterion. Crates arrived in 1940. Carefully packed canvases. Sculptures wrapped in protective materials. Works by Rembrandt, by Gainsborough, by Reynolds. Pieces that had shaped British cultural identity, now hidden in the basement of a house built by Jewish immigrants specifically to demonstrate their mastery of European culture. The irony was not lost on anyone who understood the full history. The nation whose establishment had never fully accepted the Rothschilds was now trusting them with the most valuable things it owned. The house became a strange hybrid, part empty mansion, part secret vault, occasionally a billet for troops moving through the area. Always a place where the gap between Waddesdon's original purpose and its wartime reality was impossible to ignore. The grand entrance hall, where Ferdinand had once entertained princes, held stacked inventory crates instead of guests in evening dress. Across Europe, the family's worst fears were being enacted. The Paris Rothschild mansion was seized by the Nazis in 1940, after France fell in 6 weeks of fighting that ended the Third Republic. German officers occupied the rooms. Hermann Göring personally selected pieces from the Rothschild collection for his private accumulation. This was not battlefield looting, but planned, documented, officially sanctioned theft executed by the state. Vienna properties had already been taken. The Frankfurt house was destroyed. Relatives who had not managed to escape were murdered. The exact number will never be established with certainty because the records that would establish it were in many cases deliberately destroyed. But Rothschild family members died in the camps alongside the millions of other European Jews who were killed by the machinery of the Nazi state. The name that had once stood for financial power in every European capital offered no protection against a system built specifically to erase everyone who carried it. Letters reached Waddesdon slowly, through neutral countries and delayed diplomatic channels. Each envelope contained worse news than the last. Cousins missing, homes emptied under legal pretexts that made dispossession look like bureaucratic procedure. Businesses dissolved by decree, bank accounts drained by official order. James, serving in British uniform, received these updates between military duties. The mental and emotional whiplash was severe, fighting to defend a civilization while learning that civilization was demonstrating elsewhere what it was fully capable of doing to people it had decided were not entitled to the protections it offered everyone else. Waddesdon itself stood. The roof held. The collections were intact. The art stored in its basement survived the war undamaged. Every canvas accounted for. Every sculpture returned to London unharmed when the National Gallery began reclaiming its works as the fighting ended in 1945. The house had done its job. It had protected what was placed in its care. When James came home and walked the echoing rooms for the first time after years of absence, the victory felt genuine but thin. The British branch had survived. Waddesdon had survived, but the European web that had given the house its original meaning. The transnational aristocratic culture where powerful families could operate above and between national boundaries, entertaining princes and ministers and using a French chateau in England as the social hub of an international financial network, had been destroyed. The branches in Frankfurt and Vienna were gone. Family members were dead. Continental properties were rubble or in other hands. The banking empire that had once moved effortlessly between capitals was now confined to the countries where the family still had any foothold at all. Ferdinand had built Waddesdon for a world that no longer existed. What survived was the building, and the question of what to do with it. Part 10. After the performance. Saving the house by changing its purpose. James walked through Waddesdon in 1945 and faced a problem with no obvious elegant solution. The building was structurally sound. The collections were intact. The grounds could be restored with sufficient investment. But the economic reality of maintaining a chateau of this scale in post-war Britain was brutal. Country houses across England were failing. Inheritance taxes and death duties were systematically destroying the financial foundations of aristocratic estates that had taken generations to accumulate. Great houses were being stripped of their contents, converted into schools and hospitals and institutional facilities, or simply demolished because no buyer could be found willing to accept the maintenance costs. The Rothschilds were not immune to this pressure. The banking operations had survived the war in reduced form, but the need for a grand country estate to serve as the social hub of a transnational financial network had largely disappeared along with the network itself. On paper, the options were clear. Sell the house, auction the collection, hand the property to an institution, and walk away. Other families in comparable situations were making exactly these choices every month throughout the late 1940s and early 1950s, and the landscape of English country houses was changing rapidly and permanently as a result. But there was someone who could not accept that answer. Dorothy de Rothschild, James's wife, saw something different when she looked at Waddesdon. Not simply a beautiful and expensive problem, but a document. A record in stone and wood and French limestone of a particular and unrepeatable moment in European history. Evidence of extraordinary ambition and extraordinary vulnerability simultaneously. A building that told a story more complicated and more important than any simple narrative of aristocratic wealth could contain. To sell it off or allow it to decay felt like tearing out a chapter that ought to remain accessible. To preserve it merely as a private family residence felt increasingly unrealistic and increasingly at odds with what the house had actually been, which was never simply a home but always a statement, a performance, a carefully managed public argument about what the Rothschilds were and what they deserved. The solution they moved toward was radical for its era. A formal arrangement with a national trust, the British organization created to preserve places of historic importance for public benefit, that would shift Waddesdon from private palace to national heritage site. Not a simple donation. The negotiations were detailed and genuinely complex, involving provisions for family involvement in ongoing management, standards for the preservation of the collections, and carefully defined parameters for public access that balanced the need for visitors with the need to protect what they were visiting. Agreeing to this transition required acknowledging something that Ferdinand, in the deepest psychology of his project, had spent his entire life resisting. That Waddesdon's greatest remaining value lay in its historical significance rather than in its continued use as a private status symbol. That the house's meaning extended beyond the family. That the surest way to preserve what Ferdinand had created was to surrender exclusive ownership of it, to open it to the very public that he had been performing for from behind the gates. James died in 1957, before the full transition was finalized. Dorothy carried the project forward. The formal arrangement with the National Trust was completed in the late 1950s, though the family maintained active involvement in management and continued expanding the collections. Waddesdon acquired a new identity, no longer a private residence performing aristocratic belonging, but a museum and heritage site attempting, cautiously and with increasing ambition, to tell its own history honestly. That ambition proved more complex than anyone had initially planned, because telling the history of Waddesdon honestly meant asking questions that earlier generations of curators and family members had carefully avoided. What exactly had Ferdinand been doing when he built this house? How specifically had the money been earned that paid for every stone and painting? What was the actual experience of the servants whose labor made the performance possible? How had anti-Semitism shaped the family's choices and constrained their freedom, even at the height of their power? What compromises had they made to survive inside a system that had never fully accepted them? For decades after opening to visitors, the official story stayed on the comfortable surface. Tours talked about architecture and the provenance of paintings and Ferdinand's exquisite taste. Guides led visitors through rooms hearing about French furniture and Sèvres porcelain and Renaissance portraits. Almost nothing was said about the lives lived in this house, the political storms that had raged outside its windows, the servants' existence below stairs, or the specific experience of being a Jewish family in Victorian and Edwardian England. It was beautiful history, comfortable history, history that let people admire wealth and culture without having to think too hard about how either was actually produced. It was also incomplete in ways that eventually became impossible to ignore. Part 11. The boxes in the attic. What happened when someone actually looked? The attic at Waddesdon held decades of material that no one had seriously examined. Boxes of household accounts. Employment records for hundreds of servants whose names had never appeared in any guidebook or public history of the house. Letters between family members discussing subjects that had been carefully kept out of the polished narratives offered to visitors. Invoices listing, with the meticulous precision of Victorian bookkeeping, the cost of every element of the house. Every chandelier, every painting, every carved stone in the facade. Private correspondence revealing anxieties that the family's public performance had been specifically designed to conceal. In the 1990s and 2000s, a new generation of curators and historians began working through this material with the systematic attention it deserved. What they found complicated every simple story the house had been telling about itself. The servant records were particularly revealing. Names, ages, positions, wages, reasons for hiring and dismissal. The complete administrative record of hundreds of people who had made Waddesdon function over the decades. Most stayed only a few years. Some remained for 20 or 30. A handful were dismissed for reasons that ranged from the understandable, persistent dishonesty, chronic unreliability, to the chilling by contemporary standards. Women dismissed automatically upon becoming pregnant, regardless of circumstances. Employees let go without references for minor infractions that effectively blacklisted them from comparable employment anywhere in the country. The wage books told a story of their own. A head housemaid in the 1890s earned approximately £30 per year. A scullery maid earned around 12. The butler drew closer to 80, plus accommodation and meals. By the standards of the era and the available alternatives, these were competitive wages. But context changed everything. Ferdinand routinely spent thousands of pounds on a single painting. In some years, the entire annual wage bill for the household came to less than the price of one significant acquisition. The class hierarchy that organized every dimension of life at Waddesdon was visible in the numbers in a way that polite language had always managed to obscure. The private letters between family members exposed anxieties that the public Waddesdon had always hidden. Ferdinand, writing about his isolation in England, about drawing room anti-Semitism he encountered even among people who accepted his dinner invitations, about the knowledge that no matter how perfect a house, a portion of British society would always regard him as fundamentally foreign. Later letters traced the rising terror around European fascism in the 1930s. Careful calculations about how publicly Jewish to be too visible and you became a convenient target, too invisible and you risked losing the community and identity that gave the whole project meaning. Discussions about shifting assets, worries about cousins in Germany and Austria who were running out of time. These discoveries were uncomfortable. They dismantled the idea of Waddesdon as a straightforward success story, as a simple monument to taste and achievement that asked no hard questions of its visitors. But they were essential. They showed that even immense wealth could not fully protect a Jewish family from the prejudices of their era. That the performance of belonging had been relentless and exhausting and never quite complete. That the castle on the hill had always been more fragile than it appeared from the carefully choreographed approach road. Curators now faced a genuine choice. Continue offering the sanitized version, gorgeous rooms, impeccable taste, the end, or thread these tougher truths into the interpretation that visitors received. They chose the harder path, gradually and carefully, but with genuine commitment. New interpretive panels appeared, naming and describing the servants who had kept the house running. Exhibitions were developed that engaged directly with Ferdinand's experience as a Jewish immigrant in Victorian England. Tours began talking honestly about the family's wartime history, both as targets of Nazi persecution and as contributors to Britain's war effort. Archives were opened to researchers whose topics the house had previously avoided engaging with. Labor historians studying Victorian domestic service, scholars documenting anti-Semitism in British culture, specialists in the history of wealth inequality and old money. Some visitors objected. They arrived wanting the fairy tale. Elegant rooms, glittering chandeliers, an uncomplicated fantasy of how the other half lived at the peak of the Gilded Age. They did not want to think about class exploitation or religious prejudice or the moral complexity of banking fortunes built on systems that concentrated power in ways that had real consequences for real people who were not in the room. Others responded very differently. Younger visitors in particular reacted strongly to the honesty. They found something valuable in a historic house that did not pretend, that acknowledged the servant's labor, that named the prejudice Ferdinand had navigated, that was willing to ask what all this beauty had cost and who had ultimately paid. The Rothschild family's continued involvement required tact. This was, after all, in an important sense, still their story. But they largely supported the more complete approach, understanding that genuine respect for the house's history required telling the whole story rather than the flattering fragments. Dorothy de Rothschild's decision to work with the National Trust had made this evolution possible. Once Waddesdon stopped serving as a live private status symbol, the pressure to maintain a flawless social facade eased. What remained was history, messy, morally ambiguous, deeply human history that resisted simple heroes and villains, and showed instead real people making difficult choices inside structures that constrained everyone, but some far more tightly than others. Part 12. The Template and what it taught the world. Walk into almost any film or television series about aristocratic wealth, and you will recognize Waddesdon. Not necessarily the building itself, but the template it established and that subsequent generations have copied so thoroughly that it now feels like a natural feature of the landscape rather than a deliberate invention. The long gravel drive cutting through managed parkland. The slow ascent building anticipation before the house breaks into view. The sudden reveal of a massive chateau against the sky. Tall windows glowing at dusk or in the warm light of a summer afternoon. Staff in formal dress, moving through perfectly staged rooms with the practiced invisibility that distinguishes Waddesdon-style service from ordinary hospitality. These elements have appeared in Downton Abbey, in Brideshead Revisited, in Gosford Park, in The Crown, and in dozens of other period productions that use English country houses as their setting. When those productions are not actually filming at Waddesdon, they are borrowing its visual grammar. The same French-influenced facades, the same sweeping terraces, The same interior arrangements that organize space according to the logic of performance rather than ordinary domestic use. This visual language is so thoroughly embedded in the cultural imagination that it seems natural, inevitable, as if great inherited wealth has always expressed itself through French Renaissance stone and clipped lawns and silent, invisible service. It has not. This is an invented tradition, and the people who invented it were doing something specific and historically interesting when they did. The English aristocracy already had its own architectural vocabulary. Georgian boxes, Palladian villas, genuinely medieval castles that needed no argument about their antiquity because the antiquity was built into their fabric. These houses announced lineage. They said, "We have been here longer than anyone can remember." That was the claim they were making, and the architecture made it effortlessly without visible effort because genuine antiquity requires none. Ferdinand's generation of wealthy outsiders could not make that claim, so they made a different one. Not ancient bloodlines, but unimpeachable taste. Not centuries of inheritance, but demonstrated mastery of culture. Not we have always been here, but we understand European civilization as well as anyone who was born into it. Possibly better, because we have studied it without the luxury of taking it for granted. The French chateau style was perfect for this argument. It announced, "I know the codes of civilization so thoroughly that I can detach them from their original context and reassemble them on an English hilltop without losing any of their authority." The strategy worked so effectively that it became the global template. American Gilded Age fortunes copied the playbook with conscious deliberateness. The Vanderbilts built Biltmore in North Carolina, an even larger French chateau, modeled explicitly on the Loire Valley houses that had inspired Waddesdon. The Astors, the Rockefellers, and the rest of the industrial fortunes that remade American economic life in the late 19th century all gravitated toward European architectural styles that announced sophistication rather than frontier money. They were doing what Ferdinand had done, using architecture as a credential, turning buildings into arguments that said this is not merely cash, but culture. Today, the same script plays out through social media in miniaturized form. Waddesdon's official feeds show hundreds of thousands of followers the same set pieces. The formal gardens in autumn color, Christmas lights on the stone facade, the fountain at Blue Hour reflected in still water. Every image reinforces the aesthetic. This is elegance. This is aspiration. This is what success should look like when it has fully arrived. What those images do not show is what you have just spent 12 chapters reading. They do not show Ferdinand pacing the house alone at night, aware that the building would never quite purchase the belonging he actually needed. They do not show servants tumbling out of bed at 4 in the morning to make luxury look effortless by noon. They do not show the anti-Semitic cartoons in the mainstream press, the seized properties, the emergency family meetings in the library discussing escape routes, the crates of national art treasures waiting out the blitz in the basement alongside the wine. The aesthetic is genuinely gorgeous. The context is genuinely complicated. Beauty does not cancel that complexity. It only makes the complexity easier to look away from. That gap between image and reality is, in the end, what old money has always depended on. The performance works because most people only ever see the costume. The long drive, not the calculation. The formal garden, not the labor. The glittering dinner, not the anxiety running underneath it. Knowing this does not make Waddesdon less impressive. If anything, it makes the house sharper and more interesting as an object of serious attention. It stops being a beautiful backdrop and becomes a document. A case study in how wealth performs legitimacy, how outsiders manufacture belonging, how power dresses itself up as taste, and how the performance can be maintained across generations while the original conditions that made it necessary change beyond recognition. Epilogue: what the house knows now. The sun is dropping below the horizon. The electric lights are coming on in the rooms of Waddesdon Manor, as they have for over 130 years. Electric light being Ferdinand's most quietly triumphant announcement that he could bring modernity to a country estate that his aristocratic neighbors were still lighting with gas. The chandeliers, dark during the blackout, dark during the periods of neglect and institutional conversion, are blazing again. The house looks, from the carefully maintained approach road, very much as it has always looked. But we know now what those lights fall on. We know that the entrance hall was designed by a man who was grieving his wife and his child, and who had decided to build something that would never abandon him, even if the world around it always had. We know that the weekend parties in those glittering rooms were not simply elegant entertainments, but carefully managed performances of belonging. Social arguments conducted in French furniture and 12-course dinners, directed at an audience that appreciated the quality of the performance while quietly maintaining its right to withhold the one thing the performer most wanted. We know that below the reception rooms, in service corridors that are part of the museum displays now, hundreds of men and women spent their working lives enabling an illusion of effortlessness. Rising before dawn, moving invisibly through spaces they could never occupy as guests, executing the labor that made luxury look like it generated itself. Their names are in the archive boxes now. Their wages are in the account books. Their stories are beginning, slowly and incompletely, but with genuine intention, to be told alongside the stories of the family upstairs. We know that the collection of European masterpieces on the walls was assembled partly from other families' financial disasters, ancient aristocratic houses that had been forced to sell their art to survive economic pressures that their own class system had generated. We know that the paintings spent the Second World War in the basement, serving the nation that had never quite fully accepted the family that sheltered them. We know that the chateau survived the 20th century while the world it was built for was destroyed. That the network of transnational banking power that had paid for every stone was shattered by 2 world wars. That the European Jewish community that the Rothschilds were part of, the community that had produced the culture and the commercial intelligence and the specific resilience that made the family possible, was partially destroyed by a state that had turned the family's visibility and success into justifications for elimination. We know that the house was saved from post-war obsolescence by a woman who understood that its greatest value lay in its historical honesty rather than its continued use as a private status symbol. And that honesty, in this case, meant acknowledging the servants, the anti-Semitism, the fragility of wealth that seemed impregnable, the gap between what the house performed and what the house actually was. What Waddesdon offers now is something Ferdinand never intended, but that is more valuable than what he designed the house to provide. Not a polished confirmation of aristocratic achievement, not a fantasy of effortless elegance that lets visitors feel they are glimpsing a more gracious past, but a mirror, genuinely complex, genuinely uncomfortable in places, genuinely honest about the transactions and the costs and the compromises that produce the beauty they are looking at. The house teaches uncomfortable lessons. That wealth does not guarantee safety, especially when the wealth is visible and the safety is conditional and the world outside the gates is deciding what it thinks about you. That belonging purchased through sustained perfection is exhausting and never fully secure, because the standards of the people whose acceptance you're trying to earn are not fixed and not fully within your control. That beauty almost always sits on top of invisible labor, and that acknowledging that labor does not diminish the beauty, it simply makes it honest. That you can be simultaneously powerful and vulnerable, celebrated and despised, essential to a civilization and targeted by it. That this tension is not an exception to history, but one of its most consistent features. Ferdinand built Waddesdon to last forever, to nail down permanence, to prove that the Rothschilds belonged in Europe as securely and as unambiguously as any family with a coat of arms older than the printing press. What he got, in the end, was something different and perhaps more durable, a house that lasted not because it successfully purchased belonging, but because it became too honest and too interesting to destroy. The building is still here. The collections are still intact. The gardens are still maintained. The chandeliers are blazing again, and visitors from every background walk the rooms that Ferdinand designed for princes, past the portraits he rescued, through the library where ministers discussed financing and where, later, family members discussed survival. The question that the house has always been asking, what do you build when you know that no fortress is permanent, now has a more complete answer than Ferdinand was able to formulate in his own lifetime. You build something honest. You build something that can outlast its original purpose by becoming useful in ways its creator did not anticipate. You build something that tells the full story, not just the glittering surface, but the calculation beneath it, not just the elegant rooms, but the service corridors that made them possible. Not just the triumph of arrival, but the anxiety of never being entirely certain you were allowed to stay. The sun has dropped. The house is lit from inside. The reflections catch in the fountain below the terrace. And if you are paying attention, if you're looking at the whole building rather than just the beautiful parts, you can see all of it. The achievement and the cost. The elegance and the labor. The belonging that was performed and the belonging that was never quite secured, and the house that survived both. That is the inheritance Waddesdon offers now. Not a fantasy, a mirror. And what you see in it depends entirely on how honestly you are willing to look.